Hi everyone. Today I'll be responding to an episode from the Total Liberation podcast titled Post-Veganism, Beyond the Diet. I usually try to make my videos somewhat visually engaging, but I honestly don't have time for that right now. And since it's a podcast I'm responding to, I figured a podcast-style response is appropriate. So feel free to listen to this while doing chores or something. Anyway, the Total Liberation podcast is hosted by Mexi, who is someone I respect, so my aim here is not to trash her. But I feel compelled to respond to the ideas she put forth in this episode because, well, I don't agree. So let's get into it. If you're unfamiliar with the concept of total liberation, it's a political philosophy and movement, also referred to as total liberation ecology, or veganarchism, that combines anarchism with a commitment to animal and earth liberation. Whilst more traditional approaches to anarchism have often focused primarily on opposing the state and capitalism, total liberation is additionally concerned with opposing all additional forms of human oppression, as well as the oppression of other animals and ecosystems. Proponents of total liberation typically espouse a holistic and intersectional approach aimed at using direct action to dismantle all forms of domination and hierarchy, common examples of which include the state, capitalism, patriarchy, racism, heterosexism, cissexism, disableism, ageism, speciesism, and ecological domination. I am very sympathetic to this concept. I mean, it sounds great, but I don't feel like I have enough knowledge on political theory to call myself an anarchist. I'm open-minded, I'm agnostic. Mexi and her guest Ash begin the episode by defining post-veganism as thinking beyond just consumer-based activism.
What we want to say with this term really is thinking about, where do you go? Like, where do we go when we realize that consumer-based activism is insufficient, but we still care. We still care about total liberation. How do we actually take seriously the idea that veganism is a political stance and a political movement that should be aimed at dismantling systems of oppression, right? Where do we go from there? So we kind of thought post-veganism, being vegan for X amount of years and just kind of coming to this point of what now? What next? What do we really do to dig in here and make change? Because, has what we've been doing been making change? No. Has it been making us feel better? Yes. But is that enough? Yeah, we're definitely not meaning for this episode to be some kind of conservative turning away from animal rights or environmentalism, etc. But we really do want to push the movement further to really try to broaden and expand the meaning of veganism or just total liberation activism to be something that I think hopefully will be more effective in the long run, something that might be also more inclusive and less ableist. This is kind of an episode for everyone. If you are vegan, it's hopefully going to inspire you to push further and to also, maybe take it easy on people who can't always participate fully in the consumer-based vision of veganism. Mm-hmm. And if you're not, it's just a plea to think about environmentalism, animal rights, all of these things, and how all of these issues are connected. To really think about what ways can we participate in building a future that is liberated for everyone, for the environment, hopefully for animals. And, thinking about the ways that you might be able to participate outside of just 100% consumer-based activism, right?
I would love it if people would come away with this episode kind of thinking more broadly about these issues rather than seeing, because I know you and I have both encountered so many people out there who see veganism, the individual consumer practice, as being the first step and flagship in total liberation, mm-hmm. animal liberation, environmental justice.
Yeah.
And there's really so much more to it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And so hopefully, this is coming from two very long time vegans. So hopefully it's well received, it's just us really grappling with both of our journeys and the impact that we wanted to have versus the impact that maybe we realistically have had. And then, where do we go from here?
All right, let's pause for a sec. They say this is coming from two longtime vegans, so hopefully it's well received. Don't be deceived, they're both no longer vegan, which they discuss toward the end of the episode. I'm sure if they see this video, they'll take issue with the title, as they clearly state that they still care about the issue of animal exploitation, and they don't want this episode to be perceived as a conservative turning away from animal rights and environmentalism. However, I don't think my title is unfair, because the overall message is anti-vegan, despite its pro-vegan packaging. As with any other social justice movement, there's a spectrum of opposition. Mexi and Ash are more towards the middle of that spectrum. They're nowhere near as anti-vegan as someone like Pierce Morgan, but that doesn't mean they aren't anti-vegan. I don't disagree that veganism is a political stance rather than a diet, and that in order to achieve animal liberation, we need systemic change. A consumer boycott alone is not enough to bring about that goal. However, the key word here is alone. They say we need to think beyond just consumer-based activism. I agree. But they go on to argue that boycotting animal agriculture is futile, and that their consumption of animal products is justifiable and not rooted in speciesism. That's where I disagree.
I thought we could start by kind of recapping why veganism as just a diet, like as just something that you go to the grocery store and buy, is woefully insufficient for making systemic change. So did you want to kick us off with that?
Yeah. I'll get us started with kind of our first bulletin point here, and that's despite the fact that vegan menu items and vegan grocery store items have become more popular than ever before, animal production is still on the rise, right? The use of animals in industrial agriculture and industrial food production hasn't slowed down. Mm-hmm. So veganism as some kind of consumer boycott, which we'll get into more later, doesn't seem to have done what it set out to do.
Yeah, exactly. And people will point out that, sure, there's been population increase, but the increase in animal consumption has really outpaced proportionally the increase in population. So it's more than can be just accounted for by an increase in population. So, and I mean, I guess you could argue like, well, if there were no vegans, then, it would be even worse. But that's really, really hard to quantify, right? Considering that our movement is on the rise and it still isn't making a dent, in decreasing animal production. So there's that. And I think part of the reason why it's not really making a dent is due to the fact that there are, we're living in what some people refer to as monopoly capitalism right now. And, most of the vegan companies have been bought out and are owned by larger companies that either also own other companies that produce animal products or just are the companies that produce animal products. So you're just really giving your money to the same people, and they don't really care if you're eating.
Yeah. The kind of go-to metaphor, I guess, that keeps coming to my mind for this one is Burger King selling Impossible Burgers.
Yeah.
Like you can now get a fully vegan burger meal at your Burger King, but the money goes to one of the most prolific sources of animal exploitation, right? Like a fast food burger restaurant. Like there's kind of a disconnect in veganism as some kind of politically engaged consumer practice, if at the end of the day, like the money still goes right back to the thing we're ostensibly here to stop.
Exactly. Yeah. You even said, is it vegan to go to Burger King and eat a burger at Burger King? And it's like, if you're trying to see veganism as a consumer boycott, then no.
Yeah, and I definitely like that's something that I've said a lot in our voice notes back and forth. Like, is going to Burger King to get a vegan meal vegan?
Right.
And I don't mean that as like because veganism, I mean, like, is plagued with so many like pseudo gatekeepy individual purity. Like, oh, is it really vegan if you're doing X, Y, and Z? Kind of arguments, but I mean that as a more like a direct political question, like what is veganism if you can be totally vegan but still do all of your kind of like food shopping at like these prolific sources of animal abuse.
Exactly. And we actually had someone on the podcast nicknamed Vegan Batgirl. So I'll link that below. But she is involved with like lobbying and to change laws and things like that. And she talked about how, the government subsidies, and they're pretty similar in the US and Canada. They basically mean that supply and demand don't operate as it ostensibly is supposed to within animal agriculture. And of course, as anti-capitalists, we know that supply and demand, there's a lot of problems with that theory anyway. But given the fact that the government is going to bail out these companies anyway, supply and demand doesn't work in the same way. And so a boycott, which again, we're going to return to, isn't going to be effective if supply and demand isn't going to be affected, right? If they aren't hit by losses, then they're not going to reduce their production. And that's exactly what we see. We see actually the dairy companies, dumping out gallons and gallons of milk because they're not going to reduce production. They're just going to get bailed out. Yep. So unless we're changing that, we're not going to make a lot of headway with this, pseudo boycott.
And I think, like we've mentioned boycotts so many times. Right. I think the thing about boycotts is that kind of historically, boycotts have a very short time window than they operate. Like Amazon, Amazon's Black Friday, Cyber Monday deals.
Right.
Every year there's a boycott for that, and that boycott lasts for the duration of the sale. Blackout Friday, don't shop at Amazon. And that's called for directly by workers from Amazon looking to cause a hit to their profits. And so we have a target. It's very specific in terms of its time window and its goals. And so it's easy to recruit people for a one-off, short-term boycott. If Burger King had some kind of, sale, if Burger King did a sale on something and we got like a short-term boycott for it. Or like when the coffee shops are unionizing and they call for a community boycott of the coffee chain during the unionizing effort. There's something that has a very specific and direct goal and very short term. But the goal of total liberation or animal liberation specifically is incredibly complex. It can't be reduced to something. It's hard to do a boycott to create a just world wherein we coexist with animals, because that's a gigantic issue full of so many multifaceted components. And the time window for that can't be short term. The time window for that is generational.
Right.
You can't call a generational boycott on a Burger King. That would just kind of like fundamentally not work.
Yeah, and that's partly why it's not working, because it has to be generational. There's so much time for it to be just completely co-opted by these large corporations who can then offer us both options, and then our boycott is ineffective.
Absolutely.
Like it's no longer targeted. So yeah, that's a great point. That it's not to say that boycotts in general are never going to work, but it's this particular approach, because it has to take so long and be so involved. There's so many companies that we would have to boycott. It just gets really messy and ultimately ineffective.
Mexi and Ash seem quite confident that consumer choices have no real effect on supply chains. I'm not sure where this confidence is coming from, because they fail to cite a single source to support this narrative. They say this is evident because animal product consumption is on the rise, despite a growing population of vegans. Mexi predicts the response will be that this doesn't account for general population growth, and that without vegans, the number of animals exploited each year would be even higher. But instead of actually countering this argument, she brushes it off by saying it's too complicated, it's too hard to quantify. Ash equates purchasing an Impossible Whopper from Burger King to purchasing a standard Whopper. But buying plant-based products from retailers that also sell animal products is in no way equivalent to buying animal products. He doesn't actually explain how buying a vegan meal from Burger King furthers animal exploitation. He just says it like it's obvious. But vegans aren't out to boycott Burger King. We're out to boycott animal exploitation. Mexi conflates all levels of the supply chain when she says, you're just giving your money to the same people and they don't really care. Like, sure, the retailers don't really care, but the meat, dairy, and egg farmers certainly prefer that you eat their products as opposed to plant-based alternatives. Hence why they lobby the government and pump out deceptive ad campaigns. She then argues that government subsidies and bailouts render the vegan boycott futile. She references an episode where she interviews Connie Spence, who runs the org Agriculture Fairness Alliance, which lobbies the government to stop subsidizing animal agriculture. I'm fully on board with AFA's mission, but I think it's misguided to suggest that subsidies completely nullify consumers' impact. They make our boycott less effective, sure, but less effective is not the same as ineffective. She goes on to say that boycotts are only effective if they're short-term and specific. This makes no sense. First of all, the vegan boycott is specific. Its focus may not be as narrow as a boycott against an individual retailer, but that doesn't mean that what we're boycotting isn't clearly specified. And second, the reason most boycotts fail is because they're short-term. A successful boycott is one that's sustained. Change doesn't happen in the short term. Vegans are painfully aware of this. These criticisms are ironic, considering their goal of total liberation. This goal is inherently more complex and multifaceted than animal liberation. Do they think this will be achieved in the short term? Obviously not. So why measure the success of a boycott in the short term? We can say the same thing about direct action efforts. Protesting clearly doesn't produce immediate results, but that doesn't mean it's not an effective tactic. Again, I'm not advocating for a consumer boycott to be our only tactic. A successful social justice movement requires a diversity of strategies and tactics. Also, it's important to note that any political wins we gain in the short term are at risk of being retracted if cultural attitudes and behaviors don't shift along with those policy changes. So we can't just focus on systemic change. We have to fight for both.
And in kind of the analogy I brought up in an earlier conversation that you and I had is recycling. Recycling, I see recycling as definitely being a very important part of prefiguration and something that would be necessary in a better world, right?
Mhm.
Reusing the raw materials that we can literally use a second time to create tools or shipping containers or whatever, right? There's plenty of materials out there that we could just use again. But like in so many communities here in the United States, when you throw your recyclables into the blue recycling containers, they just get sent to the same dump that your trash goes to.
Mhm.
And so many restaurants, they've got the divided garbage bin that has garbage on one side, recycle on the other, and they both go into the same bag.
Mhm.
Recycling has been recaptured by capital and is now part of environmental theater, right? We think we're doing something good. We think we're participating,
Mhm.
but so much of recycled material just gets wasted back into the same systems that we're trying to oppose by it.
Mhm.
And the kind of individual practice of veganism I see as being very similar. Aspects of it could be part of prefiguration, but as it stands currently, it's been turned into kind of this theater for environmental or liberatory practice.
Absolutely. I love that analogy. I think that's really, really spot on.
Sadly, only a fraction of items placed in recycling bins actually get recycled. While we should still recycle, because a 30% recycle rate is better than 0%, I think it's apt to call recycling theater. However, I don't think the comparison to boycotting animal products is valid. We'll dig into the economics in a bit, but choosing vegan products is much more difference-making than recycling.
Because veganism is just a vote with your dollars thing, because it's just a consumer practice, we've been like I bought and sold by our corporate overlords on this one. We're at the point where like I have seen so much discourse about like vegan leather jackets are
Mm,
better because they don't harm animals, but it's actually just a giant hunk of petrochemical nightmare fuel.
exactly.
And the vegan alternative industry it just is a thriving landscape of like mockery to the core values of veganism, whether you came at this
Yes.
for animal rights or you came at this for environmentalism or even personal health.
Mhm.
If the kind of deeper political machinations of veganism as a way of being are not interesting to an individual, like even if you're just concerned with like some kind of nebulous health value thing, like all of the plastic that has come to supplant like animal products is just baffling to me, and
Mhm.
how readily veganism is kind of like a broader set of movements kind of accepts that,
Mhm.
like the level to which it's been so thoroughly recaptured and tamed and kind of like yoked and broken of any radical potential, and now it's just like you go to Target and you buy a pack of Impossible sausages and a shirt that says "Go vegan," and
Mhm.
now you're doing your part. and but that's kind of materially indistinguishable from someone going to Target and buying like a 6-pack of brats and a shirt that says BBQ time, baby.
Yeah.
We really need to stop conflating plastic with animal products. Yes, plastic is bad for the environment, but buying plastic is categorically different from buying animal products. Plastic has the potential to harm animals, but it's unlikely that the plastic you buy will kill a sea turtle. The harm caused by plastic is an indirect result of the improper disposal of it. Animal products, on the other hand, are the result of direct harm to animals. I'm not saying we should pay no mind to our plastic consumption, but we should recognize the moral difference here. To say that a package of Beyond sausages and a t-shirt with a vegan message is materially indistinguishable from a package of brats and a t-shirt with a carnist message is just delusional. Farming peas and processing them into a sausage in a lab with other plant-derived ingredients doesn't involve putting animals in gas chambers or slitting their throats. There's a significant distinction for you. As for the t-shirts, this is like saying a pride flag is materially indistinguishable from a Nazi flag. Maybe in a literal material sense, but these items are starkly different in terms of what they symbolize. Everything Mexi and Ash have presented so far has been an appeal to futility, and they're wrong from both an economic standpoint and a sociological standpoint. Stephen McMullen and Matthew Haltman addressed these claims in their research paper Against Inefficacy Objections, the Real Economic Impact of Individual Consumer Choices on Animal Agriculture. They argue that there is a strong consequentialist case for boycotting animal ag, and that arguments to the contrary rely on an inaccurate understanding of the economy. Retailers purchase products in bulk from wholesalers, and there is a threshold at which the store's computer system is automated to place an order for another batch. Each consumer choice thus has a probabilistic impact. There is some probability that their choice will occur on the threshold and have a large effect, and some probability that it will not be on the threshold and have no immediate effect. Because these thresholds are not knowable to the consumer, they will have to evaluate the effect of their purchasing in terms of the expected impact. The expected impact here would mean the probability of being on the threshold times the size of the threshold impact. If chickens are ordered in batches of 50, and every 50th purchase spurs another order, then the probability of being on the threshold is 1 in 50, and the impact of a choice at the threshold is 50 chickens. In this case, the expected impact of purchasing a chicken is 1 chicken death. Adding more layers into the supply chain does not change the nature of the problem, but merely adds more probabilities and effect sizes to calculate. In this threshold setup, lower probabilities will correspond to higher effect sizes, so that the expected impact is usually similar to the impact of a purchase in a less complicated system with less uncertainty. In terms of direct impact, if you regularly purchase animal products, it's statistically inevitable that you will be that threshold buyer. And if you rarely purchase animal products, you're gambling with animals' lives. But in terms of the expected impact, you are just as responsible as the threshold buyer, because every preceding purchase contributed to that threshold being met. They go on to argue that while individual farms may be unresponsive to changes in consumer demand in the short term, the market as a whole is responsive to demand in the long term. Animal products are elastic goods, meaning they operate in a competitive market with plant-based substitutes. In a competitive market, most suppliers do not change their behavior in response to a price drop, but rather absorb the losses and keep going. The producers that will respond are those on the margin, with the best outside options or the least competitive position in the market. These marginal producers are the ones that will leave the industry in response to lower prices. In a large industry, moreover, competition will always drive the price to the point where the marginal producer is right on the edge of non-participation in the market. A drop in demand can easily leave them without a contract for a season, or with a delay between shipments. Ultimately, these industries are seeking profit, and to stay profitable, they must be responsive to consumer demand, because they can't rely on subsidies and bailouts forever. As the authors note, all of the incentives in the system, as perverse as they may be, push producers to be as responsive as is profitable to changes in consumer demand and to reduce waste. More responsiveness to consumers, if it can be done at a reasonable cost, will only improve profitability. This means that those who argue that the supply chain is not responsive to consumers are in the odd position of claiming that these firms are not sensitive enough to the profit motive, which is a difficult position to defend. Obviously, supply and demand is not as simple as the economic textbooks make it out to be. For example, our modern consumerist culture was not created by consumers demanding things. It was created by corporations manufacturing demand through marketing campaigns and planned obsolescence. But that doesn't mean that supply and demand is an entirely mythical construct. The authors conclude that there are 3 ways in which consumer impact is amplified: the supply chain effect, the network effect, and the scale effect. The supply chain effect applies to industries such as commercial fish farms, where by not purchasing carnivorous fish, you're reducing the demand for smaller fish used for feed. The network effect describes our effect on other consumers. The greater the demand for vegan options, the more available and visible they are to others. And similar to the network effect, the scale effect describes the principle of economies of scale. Production costs decrease as demand increases. So driving up demand for vegan products drives down the price, making them more affordable and therefore more accessible. Not only do vegans have an economic network effect, but we also have a powerful social network effect. Being vegan is not just about reducing our demand for animal products, it's also about sending a message to those around us that animals are here with us, not for us. The authors of this paper acknowledge this, stating, "We're sympathetic to the view that there are compelling ways to argue against meat consumption, without presuming that individual acts of consumption are difference-making." Even if Mexi and Ash were correct in their economic assessment, their actions are still wrong, because consuming animal flesh reinforces the belief that animals are food rather than sentient individuals who do not want to be eaten. And beliefs have real-world consequences. Mexi has a moderate-sized platform, which means her social impact is even greater. She's downplaying the effect she had as a vegan, and the effect she's having by stepping away from veganism, both economically and socially.
Yeah, this idea of a diet, it is...
Yes.
It gets really tricky because then there's so much, and I mean, I'm someone who is a great example of this. I mean, there's so much overlap between like EDs and young women going vegan. And that was kind of like the space that I entered, was just there was a ton of vegan influencers on YouTube and Instagram and everything that I was following, and they were all super young. And I mean, yeah, I don't know how much time we have to get into all this, but there's like the high carb, low fat, like there was all these like very specific dietary trends within the broader diet of veganism. And yeah, most of those people completely fell off because I don't want to say that they never cared about the animals, because I think that's kind of bullshit when people just kind of judge people for not being vegan anymore and they just say like, oh, they never cared or whatever. But because it was so wrapped up in diet, like there really wasn't a broader movement for liberation that these people could really connect into. And so when the diet no longer seemed to work, it was just like, okay, bye.
Yeah.
And then the whole rest of the vegan community just torched them like, oh, fuck these people, they're terrible. Just the kind of horrible comments that you get on those kind of like, oh, I'm not vegan anymore videos. And we talked about this in episode 71 that I referenced, just that to me, that's the mark of a very fragile movement. Like if it's so easy for people to fall out of the movement and then the entire rest of the movement has to just totally blow them up and just be like, oh, those people, like, don't listen to them, they're horrible people, blah, blah, blah. But if this was a movement that had more teeth, like if this was a more broad-based actual political movement and then somebody for some reason couldn't participate wholly in the diet aspect, there would still be other avenues for them to get involved. Like they could get involved in lobby group, trying to lobby the government to change the laws around subsidies. They could try to get involved with all these other avenues of like actual total liberation. And it wouldn't have to be like, oh, fuck these people, let's pretend they don't exist. It would be, there's a place for everyone in this broader, more political movement that isn't just solely based around diet, right?
Oh, absolutely, and you're completely right on so many levels with this one. Veganism has been reduced in a lot of ways, and its radical potential is kind of boiled away by turning it into a diet, by making everything like, oh, you got to get the radical liberation cookbook or something like that. Like it's just simply a consumer fad. or at least like that's kind of popularly what it's been turned into. And yeah, you get all these problems where like, oh, somebody for a variety of reasons, which is another subject we'll get into, has to stop or chooses to stop being vegan, either for a short-term period or forever. And then like you get like an entire community turning on them because it's just like diet culture. It's about purity. It's about sticking to this thing. And then like, because it's just literally a consumptive practice, it's just a diet. It's beholden to all of the politics that gets sucked in to diet culture. It's beholden to a lot of really terrible gendered stuff, fat phobia, ableism, like all of these things that are in the kind of general diet orbit. And like, sure, veganism, and vegetarianism are diets that, yeah, if you look at the research, people stick to those diets longer than they do like paleo or keto or kind of any of the other like fad diets. But like, even with that said, like it still is kind of caught up in all that stuff. And then you have people who like it's just so terrible to have like a ostensibly liberatory political apparatus imprisoning people who have an eating disorder or a variety of other, medical conditions that impact their diet needs.
Mexi insists veganism is a political movement, not a diet. Yet she's defending the very people who portray veganism as a diet against the militant vegans who torch them when they announce they're no longer vegan. I don't align with the super militant vegans like Vegan Gains and That Vegan Teacher, but I'd say that the majority of videos made in response to ex-vegans are from people like myself, who are simply pointing out the flaws in their reasoning and correcting misinformation. It sounds like Mexi thinks responses like this are harmful, which is ironic because the primary objective of these responses is to drive home the message that veganism is not a diet. When we say veganism is not a diet, we mean that it's more than a diet. It's not a specific diet, as there are many ways to eat as a vegan. It shouldn't be framed as a diet, as it's fundamentally a political stance against animal exploitation. But this is not to say that veganism doesn't have a very obvious dietary component. When Mexi and Ash say veganism is not a diet, they're arguing that the dietary component doesn't really matter that much. I disagree. The dietary component is hugely significant because food animals represent the vast majority of animals we exploit. They claim that there are other meaningful ways to participate in the movement. This is true, but we don't hold this standard for other social justice movements. There is a baseline of behavior to meet to be accepted as an anti-racist ally or trans rights advocate. Being racist or transphobic is not acceptable behavior. Going back to what Ash said earlier about veganism being viewed as the first step and flagship of total liberation, this is not without reason. Veganism is the moral baseline because it's technically a non-action. It's the withdrawal of participation in the oppression of animals. Sure, there are other ways to participate in the animal rights movement, aside from consuming a plant-based diet. But it's strange to demand acceptance from vegans as an ally to their cause when you are actively participating in the oppressive system we are fighting against. As for veganism having ties with toxic diet culture, ableism, and fat phobia, I agree that there is some overlap, which makes it all the more important to reiterate that veganism is not a diet, and there are many ways to eat as a vegan. Criphumanimal is a fantastic account to follow that calls out ableism within the vegan movement. They point out that chronically ill and disabled vegans don't make veganism look bad, they make it look accessible. Fat vegans should not be made to feel alienated or ashamed. You don't have to be the pinnacle of physical fitness to be a good representative for the vegan movement. But I don't think the reason people turn against those who quit veganism has to do with diet culture, as Ash suggests. It has to do with animal rights. The influencer who steps away from a strict whole foods plant-based diet and starts eating vegan junk food receives little to no backlash compared to the influencer who steps away from veganism. I would say that most vegans don't actually care what other people eat, as long as it's vegan.
And I mean, I think it's like embarrassing for the movement, frankly. If somebody becoming vegan and then stopping being vegan, because, and we'll get into this later, like because the definition of speciesism is just like anyone eating an animal and not actually a systemic understanding of speciesism. The idea is that if somebody goes plant-based, I should say, and then stops eating plant-based or consuming that way, it's like it shows that, to vegans who define speciesism that way, it's like basically proof that, this doesn't work, or you know what I mean? Like if somebody actually had a medical reason why they couldn't do this forever, then it's like, oh, therefore veganism doesn't work. Therefore, like it's kind of like, therefore the movement has no teeth. But that's only if you're defining it in this ridiculous way. Like if you actually define speciesism as a systemic issue that requires systemic action and collective action to address, then that wouldn't be such a big, horrible embarrassment for the movement. Like it would still be like, no, this is still valid. We still care about animal liberation. We still care about total liberation, but we understand that like this, like it can't just be about diet and that everyone has to follow this for us to get there. And so I wanted to just do a little bit of recap again of the episode 71 about the understanding of speciesism, because I think this is really key. And I think this is where the mainstream vegan movement really falls down. And even the total liberation vegan movement kind of falls down. Like I mentioned, I read, I think it was Total Liberation Ecology. And I really respect like all the writers who are part of that book. But I was a little bit disappointed because it just kind of, again, repeated what I hear often is that, you know, not only is veganism about stopping animal agriculture and like systemic abuse, it's also you can't hunt and you can't fish, right? And I think that and I understand where that's coming from because like a lot of people were framing that as like, well, that's just inherent violence. But then some anarchists and other people were kind of retorting and being like, I don't think we can talk about violence outside of like systemic violence, right? And so basically what we were talking about in episode 71 was really defining speciesism as a systemic political issue, right? So if speciesism is the systemic and institutional oppression of animals that is rampant under capitalism and has been spread through colonialism, then, you know, what we're fighting against is clear. We're fighting against those systems. We're fighting against this industry and these corporations. We're not necessarily fighting for a world where nobody ever consumes an animal, right? Because if you get into that territory, then it becomes really difficult to, you know, fight for land back or to fight for respect for the treaties and things like that. And, you know, I want to be careful because obviously it's like, obviously there are indigenous vegans and these are, you know, conversations that are happening in communities. But, you know, in all of the work that I do, and I think I've told the story before, is, you know, one of the indigenous people that I work with lives up in the tundra up north in, well, so-called Canada. And he was inviting me up to his territory to see his IPCA and whatever. And I was like, I mean, he knew that I was vegan, so he was like, well, would you consider not being vegan for this trip? Because like I don't know what you're going to eat, right? Like if you're coming out with us to be on the land, like I literally don't know what you're going to have. Because you could think about it. They're up in the tundra, like they're not cultivating a lot of stuff. Like they are hunting and trapping. And the grocery stores up there, I don't know if people have seen sometimes, you know, pictures of this stuff gets shown on Twitter and whatever. But it's like, you know, a head of lettuce is like $50 or something, you know, something ridiculous because of the cost it takes to ship everything up there. But, you know, for nations like that, they aren't fighting, you know, they're fighting for respect for the trees, respect for their trapping and hunting rights, etc. They're not fighting for a bunch of like superstores and Walmarts to open up in their territories with cheaper prices so that they can buy vegan food, right? And I think that it gets really messy because a lot of theorists, like vegan theorists, will say that, you know, killing an animal for any reason, consuming an animal for any reason is wrong and it's murder and it's violence. But then they'll kind of add a cliff note like, oh, but if you're indigenous, it's fine, right? Like, like, oh, we're not coming for indigenous people. We're just coming for everyone else. And to me, like I've had so many conversations with people who have charged me with being, you know, a cultural relativist because I support indigenous rights or just the rights of like subsistence hunters and whatever. And I'm like, no, it's ideologically inconsistent if you're
Yes.
if you're framing speciesism in the way that I'm not framing it. Like if you are framing speciesism as it's violence for anyone to eat an animal for any reason, then yeah, it is going to be inconsistent for you to say that and then to also advocate for the rights, treaty rights of certain groups. But if I'm defining speciesism in this very political, systemic way, and I'm not defining it as like an individual practice of participating in a predator-prey relationship, then what I'm saying is not ideologically inconsistent. I'm not being culturally relativist. I know what I'm fighting for, and I know, like I'm fighting against the commodity status of animals.
I listened to the episode titled Speciesism is Not What You Think It Is, and I gotta say, I did not find it compelling. Their definition of speciesism makes absolutely no sense. You can watch my video Speciesism Explained in 5 Minutes for a better understanding of my position, but in short, speciesism is discrimination based on species membership. If you can't name a trait difference that is morally relevant, you cannot justify a difference in treatment. The idea that we can't really talk about violence outside of systemic violence is just asinine. It's clear that Mexi places humans above animals, as she does not hold this standard for other forms of oppression. Surely she acknowledges that individuals can be racist, sexist, or homophobic towards other individuals. Academics often make the distinction between interpersonal and institutional racism, but they're both still examples of racism. We're not just fighting against corporations, we're fighting against cultural attitudes. And that includes the cultural attitude that indigenous hunting and fishing practices are wholesome and virtuous. This view is not only speciesist, it's racist. In Western anthropology, philosophy, and literature, the noble savage is a stock character who is uncorrupted by civilization. As such, the noble savage symbolizes the innate goodness and moral superiority of a primitive people living in harmony with nature. This positive stereotype, like the model minority myth, is rooted in racism. Regarding the land back movement, I don't really see a conflict with the vegan movement. Admittedly, I don't know a lot about land back and what it entails, but can we not live in reciprocity with the land without killing animals? As Mexi pointed out, in northern so-called Canada, eating animals is necessary for survival, but in most climates there is no justification for continuing traditional hunting practices. Vegans giving a pass to the Inuit is not the same as giving a pass to indigenous people in general. The former is recognizing that some people have a genuine necessity to kill for survival, whereas the latter is cultural relativism. Legitimate predator-prey relationships are not rooted in speciesism, they're rooted in survival. But defending your supposed right to be a predator when you don't actually need to kill to survive is rooted in speciesism, because it assumes human superiority, that human interests, such as the desire to live a traditional lifestyle, are more important than the lives of other animals.
I recommend the book Braiding Sweetgrass to everyone.
Yeah,
I love
definitely.
it. It's amazing, right? But as a vegan, that was, parts of that were challenging, and parts of it, for the people I recommended it to, were challenging because it's talking about reciprocity, and it's talking about hunting and trapping and things like that, and things that I'm like, is that reciprocity? But I felt like it was really challenging in a good way. And I still do hold the position that like, I would find it very difficult to go out and hunt an animal. I would really, really fucking struggle with that. Right. And I understand why people are like, oh, that's violent. And that's like, I can't do that. But as I mentioned in the episode 71, I mean, that's just really coming from my positionality as like a white suburban woman who has never been exposed to hunting or like to needing to do that, or I've never been in any kind of reciprocal relationship with the land or animals around me. So that's just a position that I can't really understand, but it doesn't mean that I need to vilify that as like murderous barbarism, which it itself is like incredibly racist,
Definitely,
and infantilizing. Yeah, so I just think that with this more systemic understanding of speciesism, we can be ideologically consistent, and we can fight to decolonize. We can, fight alongside indigenous peoples. We can fight alongside, anyone who, needs to consume this way for any reason, and still be for total liberation, right? Like we can be not ableist. We can be really radically inclusive in our politics and have that be consistent and have that be part of a broader movement that is really aiming to address systems
Mm-hmm.
that would lead to liberation for all.
To me, not vilifying unnecessary killing as murderous barbarism is what is truly racist and infantilizing, because it plays into the noble savage trope. I don't think Mexi is being ideologically consistent here, because again, she doesn't hold the same standard for other social justice movements. She's arguing for a level of inclusivity that doesn't take into account the paradox of tolerance. We can't have tolerance without limits. The idea that anti-speciesist activists must tolerate blatant speciesism in activist spaces in order to effectively fight speciesism is completely backwards. I understand the importance of inclusivity and solidarity. We shouldn't outright refuse to work with people who say and do problematic things, because everyone is problematic to some degree. We must be willing to set aside differences and work together to achieve a common goal. But that doesn't mean we can't acknowledge where we disagree. Mexi and I share a lot of common ground. We both want to abolish capitalism and factory farming. But when it comes to animal rights, there's a critical point where we start to diverge. Her idea of animal liberation does not align with mine. I would argue that she's not actually for animal liberation. She's fine with killing animals as long as you don't sell their body parts for profit. To me, shooting an animal with a bow and arrow doesn't sound like total liberation. As for the claims of ableism, we'll address that later on when she discusses her personal health struggles that led her to reintroduce animal products to her diet.
And I think it's unfortunate that a lot of total liberation activists still focus on the diet primarily, right? Like most times when people approach them with like, oh, what can I do? The recommendations are all about like, okay, well, here's how you can eat vegan and still get all your protein or whatever it is, or here's some recipes that you can use for veganuary and then go from there. It's always starting with the diet. And the diet is really the bar that people need to meet to be able to participate in the movement. And if you're out there doing like all of the things, if you're doing direct action, if you're, forcing change of laws, if you're whatever, if you're really, really standing up with indigenous land resistance and land back and making change that way, right? Like, no, you're not part of the movement until you're consuming 100% plant-based. And the minute that you're not, like your vegan card is revoked and like, oh, you don't care, you're not doing enough, you're whatever. And I find that really sad that like
Deeply.
even, like even people who are really into total liberation, it's like, that's the bar that you need to meet in order to participate in any of this, even though we know that bar isn't going to bring us real change, right? Like it's more of like, prove to us that you're one of us by doing this. It's like what's it called, like a hazing or something.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
Like you can be one of us if you show us that you can do this, even though this has not been effective.
Yeah, and I think this is really important to like tease apart too, because like, one of the things I touched on earlier is that like the kind of broad ontology of veganism is totally broken, right? Because it's impossible to be totally vegan. Like that's not an achievable thing to have, right? Like even if you only eat a dia burger or dia cheese, impossible meat products, meat in quotes or whatever, like and you're ultra strict about all of your food sources, to not even have something that has the asterisk may contain milk or you're produced on shared equipment, whatever. Like that's still getting shipped by a truck that's running down deer. Like that's still being produced using petrochemical resources that are driving a mass extinction, which is killing more animals than any human dietary practice could hope for. Like it's still interwoven into the system. It's still pulling at all these oppressive threads. It's this inescapable thing. Like that is the nature of being interwoven into a system, right? Like we can't like isolate individual practices. And I think that speaks to the kind of failure of having veganism and vegetarianism be this bar of participation, because we wouldn't really like say that about anything else. Like if we like start like a hypothetical like environmental protest group and we're going to go picket like some oil exec meeting or something, like we wouldn't like be like, oh, well, you're not also trying to unionize your workplace, so do you really belong here?
Mm-hmm.
We wouldn't hit them with the same kind of it's just like this petty elitism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so, don't we have more important things, more direct things that we could be doing here?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, like the worst thing is when people are like trying, like where they're like, oh, well, I'm eating plant-based on Mondays, or, doing meatless Monday, or they're reducing a lot or whatever. And then they're just, again, just being like totally torched by the community because it's like, oh, don't you know that you're contributing to all this or whatever, And like, I mean, I get it, right? Like, again, this is coming from like two very long time vegans, right? Like, I do get the idea that veganism, I mean, people will say that like, oh, well, veganism is about doing as little harm as possible. So like you can't control that truck running over the deer, but you can control not participating in the brutal slaughter of, billions of animals or whatever. So, you should do that. And again, like, yeah, there is something to be said about prefiguration. And we're not here to try to dissuade people from being vegan. We're not here to like, I think needs to be said. Like, we're not here to be like, don't, the answer isn't just like giving up and forgetting about it. Like the answer is thinking bigger, right?
Mm-hmm. I've like to just put my cards on the table, like, for like medical reasons, I've had to become the inverse of the meatless Monday person. So now I'm a fish Friday person.
Right.
And so it's like that's kind of, and like I've been on both sides of that conversation too, where like when I was younger and I was trying to like do more like environmental action stuff, like people would be like, okay, well, like here are some ways you could be more vegan too, to like join the group. And then as I got older and I was in more of not necessarily leadership positions, but like more established roles, like I would deliver those same talking points to newer people to be like, oh, it's great that you're coming, that someone took time out of their goddamn weekend to join a picket line or a protest. And then I had the gall to be like, okay, but when you get home, like, are you going to be eating like dairy ice cream though? Just the asinine, the honestly ass backwards political sensibility of that from like an organizational perspective. And to now, like, I do appreciate the irony of now I'm like rounded the corner and I'm the person that's like, oh, well, I am trying to minimize my meat consumption.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah. And I'm sure there's people who will listen to this and be like, oh, fuck this guy, like,
oh, right. Yeah.
And like, fine, but that sucks.
This narrative that it's impossible to be 100% vegan is an appeal to futility. The fact that we can't avoid animal products entirely is accounted for in the definition of veganism, hence the qualifier as far as is possible and practicable. Mexi pushes back on this point, but nods along with the rest of what Ash says here. He says if you're out doing direct action and fighting for land back, you're not a part of the movement unless you're consuming 100% plant-based. You're clearly part of the indigenous resistance movement. But no, if you're not vegan, you're not living in alignment with the principles of total liberation. Again, veganism is the bar because it's a non-action, akin to not being racist or not being homophobic. I understand that there is a learning curve that requires some effort in the beginning, but after that, no real effort is required to be vegan. Unionizing your workplace is not comparable because it requires sustained effort. It requires a substantial time commitment and risk. Unionizing your workplace is akin to participating in animal rights activism. These things are morally virtuous, but not morally imperative. Also, doing good deeds such as participating in activism does not absolve you of the harm you're causing. If I said something racist and got called out for it, I doubt Mexi or Ash would jump to my defense because I do so much good work. Ash says he used to be the guy who would shame people at protests for not being vegan. I highly doubt that as an organizer, he actually approached newcomers and instead of thanking them for showing up, he asked them if they were going to go home and eat dairy ice cream. This is how carnists frame vegan advocacy, not how the vast majority of vegans actually advocate. Mexi says we're not here to dissuade people from being vegan. Maybe not intentionally, but that is what they're doing by condoning Fish Fridays and arguing that boycotts are futile. A portion of listeners will feel vindicated in their animal product consumption, especially if they're dealing with health problems. She says that the answer isn't giving up and forgetting about it. The answer is thinking bigger. Attempting to justify one's own participation in animal oppression is not thinking bigger, it's perpetuating meat industry propaganda.
And I think this is a great time to just get into the ableism of all of this. And yeah, like talk about you and I, because I think that that's another thing that the mainstream movement doesn't really grapple with. And I think that most people, and I'm the same way, like I always knew that eating 100% plant-based would not be doable for everyone. Like I admitted that like, sure, there's some people who this isn't going to work for whatever reasons, or maybe even just not indefinitely, like maybe there would be periods of time that it wouldn't work or whatever. But because in my mind, I was like, oh, but that's those people. And I imagined that that was just a very small percentage. I just didn't really grapple with that. But for people who are total liberationists and who do care about ableism and who don't want to play into that, like, okay, what does it mean then if we accept that some people will need to consume animal products some of the time, then what future are we fighting for, right? And I mean, old me was actually like pretty asinine about it too. Like I had some people in my life who had really serious medical conditions, and their doctors had advised them not to go plant-based. And I was like, oh, they just don't know that like plant-based is better and that like you could heal on a plant-based diet. But more recently, I actually looked into like what they have, and I was like, oh God, no, yeah, they should not be. They should not be eating plant-based, right? But at the time, I was just like, oh, poor them. They just, I didn't push it, but I was like, I just assumed that like they were wrong, But yeah, maybe we could talk about both of our health journeys and why we stepped away, but where that kind of leaves us in our desire for fighting for total liberation.
Yeah. Like for me, it's been really interesting, right? Because like I've always been keyed into an aspect of like conversations around ability and kind of ableism and how that works on material levels, on historic levels, because of mental health issues, and because of like mental health advocacy and stuff like that. But like, admittedly, like veganism left a kind of like a gap in my hermeneutics, right? It kind of like left me like this blank, unfilled area when it comes to like how physical issues and how mental issues can intersect with diet, right? Because just to be honest about it, none of mine did at the time, right? And then like like COVID started, and like knock on wood, still to best of my knowledge, haven't gotten COVID yet, but like as COVID restrictions started to wrap up, like went to the doctor to try and chase down like a couple, like I don't know, just like weird lingering medical issues I was having, and like one of the recommendations that came out of that is to like start incorporating animal products back into my diet. And like I'm in this weird place where like I still don't see red meat as food. It's just been so long. I like look at it and like my brain just doesn't register that as something I can eat. But like that's a me thing. That's not an argument I would put forward. But like my health has gotten better since I've like incorporated like seafood back into my like diet.
Yeah, I'm in a similar boat, and yeah, I've been very nervous to talk about this publicly, because I feel like I'll be letting down a lot of people.
Yeah. Yep.
But I'm sure people are like, well, why say anything then if it doesn't matter anyway, right? And the reason that I want to say something is just because I want to put it out there that like, yes, we care about these issues. Like we never stopped caring. And you might really care about these issues, but as you said, like if for whatever reason your ability changes and you need to take care of your health, I want people to feel good and comfortable taking care of their health, and still feel like they can participate in a broader movement for something that they care about, So yeah, my issue was I had developed a autoimmune disorder,
Mhm.
and I won't tell other people's stories, but I had friends as well who had developed similar autoimmune disorders, and we were all, working on it in our own ways and working with experts and things like that. And then eventually, yeah, we were all recommended. I also had a lot of issues with my hormones and whatever, so we were all similarly recommended. I was working with somebody before I got pregnant because yeah, I don't know. I don't know how much to dig into this, but like it would have been really dangerous for me to get pregnant and be out of balance with my thyroid in particular. Yeah, I guess I'll just leave it there. So I was working with somebody before trying to get pregnant because I was like, I really need to get this under control. Otherwise, it could be really bad for me and potentially the child. So at that point, I was recommended to start eating some animal products as well. And so I started to do that. It was like eggs and fish. And that was
Same.
it. Yeah. I was like, okay, whatever, I'm going to do this, and it'll just be temporary, and whatever. And I didn't plan to tell anyone about it because I was like, well, it's nobody's business.
Mhm.
But I do get people being like, thinking that I've had a vegan pregnancy and like wanting to talk about it or whatever. And I'm like, I just,
Okay.
I don't want to lie about that. But anyway, yeah, that was what happened. But then throughout my pregnancy, and I was the same as you. I was like, I don't view meat as food, and like it was already a stretch. And I was like, all right, I'm good with
Mhm.
this. But in the third trimester of my pregnancy, unfortunately, I started to have this issue with my blood platelets and my red blood count and all the stuff. And my platelets were basically just like plummeting. And this was concerning because there's already a risk of like hemorrhaging after you give birth. But if your platelets are very low, then like, there's more of a risk of you just like bleeding uncontrollably. And I was very lucky to get in with the midwife team. And basically, I couldn't still be with them if my platelets dropped under a certain level, and they were getting dangerously close to that. And they would have just referred me out to an OB that I had never met before. And I was planning a home birth. I didn't want to have a hospital
Mhm.
birth. And so anyway, it was just really like, oh fuck, like this is dire. I need to turn this around like within a matter of like weeks. And so I started trying to do that plant-based primarily and with supplementation. And it worked a little bit, but then it just started plummeting again. And so I really just had like a few weeks to like turn this around. So at that point, I again was working with this person, and I was just like, okay, fuck it. Like I just have to go all in to fix this so that I can like give birth safely and then like whatever. And now, the blood work that I'm getting is showing that like my autoimmune disorder is like almost healed.
Rad.
Which is like fucking wild because it's been something that I've been trying to work on for like so many years. And so at this point, like, I'm still open to like, well, in the future, maybe this will be mostly temporary or whatever, or maybe in the future it'll just be like a little bit of animal products and whatever. But right now that's where I'm at, and that's the blood work is really encouraging. And so I don't want to make big changes right now because I'm like,
Mhm.
okay, I'm still kind of struggling with like the postpartum, like all of the
Yeah.
sleepless nights, and I'm just trying to like get by. But yeah, so obviously that led us to start talking and to really grapple with like, oh my god, yeah, I mean, this thing that like I knew that could happen to some people, but I never imagined I would be one of those people. And then like here I am, but like obviously I still care about like all these issues, and like it's difficult because now I have a child. Um,
Mhm.
and for me, like the sustainability issue is like the major one of the major things, and like thinking about the world that like I want to build for him, and like the values that I want to impart to him. So yeah, I guess I just coming to this place of like, okay, I still care about all this. This is the place that I'm in right now. Unfortunately, we don't live in like a decolonized reciprocal society. So I don't feel good about my participation right now. But I also know that like for the however many years, like, I mean, over a decade that I was at least vegetarian, and then like almost a decade that I was vegan, did that make as much of an impact as I wanted it to make? And like, how do I live my values while also acknowledging
Mhm.
my ability needs? It's tough.
I don't doubt Mexi's sincerity in thinking she needed to eat animal products to address her health issues. My issue is that there's no scientific evidence that animal products are actually necessary for anyone. Where is the data showing that animal flesh is needed for the treatment of autoimmune disorders, hormone or thyroid issues? It's unfortunate to see Mexi trust the advice of her midwife, who has clearly been influenced by meat industry propaganda. Her story sounds like every other ex-vegan story. Vague mention of health problems. My naturopathic doctor told me to eat meat. I started with fish and eggs, and now I feel so much better. And of course, this is my journey. I'm very nervous to talk about this. Please go easy on me. And if you dare criticize me, you're a judgmental asshole, and you are the one hurting the vegan movement. Because judging people for eating animal products is somehow more harmful to animals than literally eating them. Make it make sense. I'm happy that her blood markers improved and that she gave birth to a healthy baby, but there's no reason to believe that eating animals was the only solution here. Unless she can name the magical healing property that is found in fish and eggs that can't be found elsewhere, her accusations of ableism don't hold up.
So for me, like total liberation activism starts with land back in the territory that I reside in. And I'm very fortunate that that's a lot of what I do in my academic career. Like I'm part of a Canada-wide project that's led by Indigenous peoples who are declaring their own protected areas to basically declare sovereignty over their territories and to be able to make management plans for that area, and then any settlers who reside in there have to respect those plans. And so that's what I'm doing. And I feel like that is contributing to kind of a total liberation activism, right? Like moving towards a decolonized food system where animal agriculture is abolished and the commodity status of animal is abolished. We've relocalized our food systems, and they look a lot more reciprocal, maybe communal kind of permaculture stuff, and just learning how to live in the environment that I'm in, right? So to me, that is part of total liberation activism, like my activism against capitalism for workers' rights. I'm helping right now with activism around stopping our government from privatizing our healthcare further.
Mhm.
Like all of that is total liberation activism, right? Like anti-racist work,
Yeah.
and like in terms of animal liberation more broadly. I mean, I definitely think land back is huge
Mhm.
because as we said, animal agriculture is incredibly colonial. And then also, like as I said, there's a lot of political activism that can be done to target the corporations that are doing this, and to force the government to stop giving them subsidies, et cetera. Like there's just a lot of activism that can be done that's part of this total liberation framework, that doesn't begin and end at what you're eating.
Oh, absolutely. Like, I think that's such a good way to look at it. Like viewing this thing holistically, right? Like viewing the entire system rather than rather than just this tiny consumptive practice, this tiny sliver that gets so much outsized attention.
Hmm.
Um, I think is so important too, and especially like all of these issues intersect with each other, right? Like like supporting a small Starbucks with 5 employees unionizing is an aspect of total liberation, right?
Hmm.
Like issues of class and race are and ability and queerness are all part of this, especially
Hmm.
here in the United States, where like trans bodies and trans individuals are increasingly becoming criminalized in some of the most horrific ways,
Hmm.
and in one of the most open expressions of fascism, like seen in this country in quite some time. And especially watching those issues and like how they intersect with race historically is really important. How they intersect with class historically is really important.
Hmm.
And like to not have like just which burger you buy at Burger King being the kind of linchpin that holds so much of this all together. And I know that's not like, the case for some of these issues, right? Like the "are you a vegan" conversation doesn't come up so much on like the union shop floor. But
Mhm.
like when, like I keep thinking about like what would happen if the Teamsters went on strike until carbon emissions were cut in half or whatever.
Mhm.
Like some measurable goal, some outcome, if we relinked class to environment, and like or like relinked class to issues of colonialism, like,
Mhm.
and to have a different appraisal of how veganism fits into this thing, as instead of being this mandatory step before you can engage with environmental issues or animal issues or issues of colonialism, to
Mhm.
instead being like, okay, this thing that could in some way be part of prefiguration that we haven't quite pinned down yet.
Mhm.
And I think like, oh, go on.
I was just gonna say, like, yeah, exactly. Like, because, like, to be clear, the animal agriculture industry has to die. Like, we do
Oh yeah.
need to destroy this industry, like, for the environment, for the animals, and whatnot. But as we mentioned, um, just consuming vegan products isn't going to take this industry down. So instead of like holding everyone up to this bar, regardless of their ability, or, maybe their ability has changed and maybe, whatever, instead of that, right, like we need to be building a broad movement that like how do we actually take down this industry, right? And how do we do it in a way that does honor the fact that there are people with different abilities that are going to need access to some things, right? And it's just not 100% of people who can do this indefinitely all the time, right? Like that actually needs to be part of the discussion, because right now it's nowhere in the discussion. It's just consume this way and that's how we're going to make a dent in the industry. It's not, and it's also leaving out a lot of people who could be allies and who could really want to participate in the movement, but they can't meet that initial bar, and so they're excluded, right? Like that's not a way to
Oh yeah.
build a robust and effective movement. So I just think like that, and I don't have the answer to that, right? Like, how do we take down this industry in a way that honors everyone's ability? I don't know, but it's not just consuming vegan. So we need
Hmm.
like this,
Absolutely.
that needs to be the starting point of our new, broader, bigger discussion of like, okay, what are our tactics now?
Oh, absolutely, right. Like this is such a large, multifaceted thing, and I think it's the answer is that there are multiple answers, right?
Hmm.
Anti-racism and anti-fascism and pro-union politics and land back are all part of ending animal agriculture as we know it,
Hmm.
and instead supplanting that with a system that, I don't know, won't destroy life on Earth as it can be recognized by humans.
Hmm.
And like, I just can't help but think like what is going to put a bigger dent into the nature and material functionality of animal agriculture, like supporting the unionization of slaughterhouse workers or shopping differently at McDonald's.
Hmm.
Like which one is going to make them more upset, right?
Hmm.
And like that's kind of like how I'm approaching this now, is like, okay, like vegan, like being agential and being aware of the products we consume and under what conditions we consume them is incredibly important,
Hmm.
right? Like, but that can't be the end all be all, because we've seen what happens. And what happens is like you get sold a cookbook and you think you've won.
Hmm.
Like you think you've won when Burger King's profit goes up because now they have a burger that they can sell to hippies, right?
Hmm.
Like, like we can't, are we so easily bought? Like, I don't know.
Hmm.
Like, I don't, and I like, again, like, in so many ways, I still see myself as like quote unquote plant based or whatever, like somehow in this broader
Hmm.
taxonomy of someone who's like aware of consumptive dietary practices, but like, like it's such a limited purview of what's going on out there in the world, full of so many broader contexts and so many like, to be quite frank about it, things that could be much, much more impactful without being nearly as alienating.
Ash downplays the impact of avoiding animal products when he says it's this teeny consumptive practice, this teeny sliver that gets so much outsized attention. Again, food animals represent the vast majority of animals we oppress, and your impact extends beyond the economic demand you create. It's not often that people buy cosmetics or fur products, or visit the zoo or aquarium, but we eat several times a day. Placing a greater focus on the dietary aspect of veganism makes sense. I'm not sure where Ash is getting the idea that supporting unions is more difference-making than changing your consumption habits. What does supporting unions even look like? I support unions in the sense that I want them to succeed, but to make an actual difference, I would have to volunteer my time to join protests. And what tangible effect would my presence have? I'm not saying it would have no effect, but the amount of Starbucks unions I would have to come out and show support for would be astronomical to come even close to the positive impact I've made as a vegan. His claim that supporting slaughterhouse workers' unions would make more of a dent for the animals than going vegan is completely baseless. You could argue that a workers' union might decrease output slightly, but to suggest that this is where vegans should be focusing our time and attention is absurd. I am currently participating in a ballot initiative to ban slaughterhouses in Denver, and one of the biggest objections people have is, what about the workers? It's a valid concern, which is why we made sure to include a measure that would prioritize the workers in a jobs program if the ban is implemented. This is how to show support for workers and animals. Helping slaughterhouse workers find better jobs is much more impactful than making their shitty jobs slightly less shitty. And for the animals, the difference a slaughterhouse ban would make compared to a workers' union is quite significant. Ash might concede this point, but the fact that he suggested this in the first place shows that the animals are an afterthought to him. As for the need to focus on systemic change over individual change, I have an entire video about this. In short, both are equally important, as individuals shape systems and systems shape individuals. And the line between the two is blurred, as Justin, aka Debug Your Brain, points out.
Something that's always struck me about this individual versus systemic dichotomy is not just that you can do both, but that the borders between the two seem fuzzy at best. If you say, I'm not going to make an individual change, I'm just going to go to protest, you as an individual still had to make the individual decision to go to a protest. The same goes for signing petitions, voting, getting a job in a particular sector that benefits a cause, going undercover at farms, etc. You're still having to make individual changes to your life in order to try and affect systemic changes.
They keep repeating the talking point that a boycott won't bring about the change we want to see, as if vegans are advocating for only this single tactic to be used. As I mentioned, I'm currently working on a campaign to ban slaughterhouses in Denver. The intention of this campaign is to target the industry rather than the consumer. I'm not against deploying this strategy. What I'm against is downplaying the significance of individual change and shitting on educational outreach that targets consumers. Another thing that came up several times throughout their discussion was the concept of prefiguration. If you're unfamiliar with the term, Adrian Kreutz defines it as a way of engaging in social change activism that seeks to bring about this other world by means of planting the seeds of the society of the future in the soil of today's. Prefiguratism is a way of showing what a world without the tyranny of the present might look like. It's a way of finding hope, but not escapism, in the realms of possibility, something that words and theories alone cannot provide. It highlights that social structures enacted in the here and now, in the small confines of our organizations, institutions, and rituals, mirror the wider social structures we can expect to see in the post-revolutionary future. In other words, be the change you wish to see in the world. It felt like Mexi and Ash brought up prefiguration in anticipation of what critics might say, but instead of actually grappling with it, they swatted it aside. Like, yes, we acknowledge the importance of prefiguration, but we're still gonna make an appeal to futility after an appeal to futility on top of an appeal to futility. Lastly, I want to address this idea that advocating for veganism as the moral baseline leaves out a lot of potential allies. The concept of a vegan ally is just stupid. Vegans are allies to animals. If you consume animal flesh, you're not being an ally. I really hate this deflection of blame, this insinuation that advocating for animal rights in a clear and consistent manner is somehow harmful to animals. You're hurting the cause by advocating for the cause. In other contexts, people like Mexi accept that advocating for a cause involves calling out harmful behavior and rhetoric. But when it comes to veganism, calling out the harmful behavior and rhetoric of others is what is deemed problematic. The vegan movement doesn't need to broaden our movement to include non-vegans, just as the trans rights movement doesn't need to broaden their movement to include transphobes. Also, I don't buy this narrative that vegans are alienating potential volunteers by holding veganism as the moral baseline. The people who actually show up for protests and pressure campaigns are the people who care about animal rights. And the people who care about animal rights are vegan. Or at least they acknowledge that they should be vegan, so they're not going to be put off by vegans advocating for veganism. I have been doing animal rights activism off and on for 10 years. In all of those years, I have yet to meet a single person who cares enough about this issue to put in the sustained time and effort to do political work for farmed animals, but isn't willing to put in the minimal effort to stop eating them. It's perfectly valid to criticize transphobic vegans for alienating transgender people, or ableist vegans for alienating disabled people. But it doesn't make sense to criticize vegans for alienating non-vegans with their vegan advocacy. If someone feels alienated by vegans advocating for veganism, they simply aren't serious about animal rights, which means they don't have the desire or fortitude to meaningfully engage in animal rights activism in the first place. Advocating for anything short of veganism fails to communicate the gravity of the situation. To quote William Lloyd Garrison on the topic of slavery abolition, "I am aware that many object to the severity of my language, but is there not cause for severity? I will be as harsh as truth, as uncompromising as justice. On this subject, I do not wish to think, or to speak, or to write with moderation. No, no, tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hands of the ravisher. Tell a mother to gradually extricate her baby from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. I am in earnest, I will not equivocate, I will not excuse, I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." This is the attitude of a truly radical activist. Mexi and Ash believe themselves to be radical thinkers, and in many ways they are. But when it comes to animal rights, their views are milquetoast. There's nothing radical about this notion of post-veganism. It's just speciesism cloaked in woke language. Thank you so much for listening. That was a long one. Possibly the longest video I've ever recorded. But I hope you enjoyed it, and please subscribe if you want to see more. Alright, peace out.